Ethnic identity is one of the many identities that human beings may possess. Diverse ethnic identities may be a source of strength and beauty for a certain country, but sometimes some individuals may manipulate ethnic identity for some personal agenda. These individuals often portray ethnic identity as a source of difference, hostility, and conflict. And whenever a society experiences ethnic-based conflicts, transitional justice might be implemented to heal the wounds and injuries of the victims so that the society can restore peace and can have a permanent, sustainable peace and togetherness. Hello and welcome, viewers. Today on Messenger, we're going to talk on identity, conflict, and transitional justice. And for this, I'm joined by Dr. Felix Nahinda, who is independent researcher and consultant based in Netherlands. Dr. Felix, great to have you in my show.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
All right. Dr. Felix, thank you very much for joining us, and I appreciate your time. Let me say a few words about yourself. So Dr. Felix Nahinda got his PhD degree from Tilburg University, Netherlands. Dr. Felix holds Master of Law from the Royal Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights in Sweden. Dr. Felix's academic interests cover issues such as indigenous rights, transitional justice, peace building, identity politics, and victimology. Dr. Felix, I know identity is one of your core research area, your core study area. So how identity is scientifically defined, and do you think identity difference could be a source of conflict in a society?
Oh, fantastic. One, in academic literature, especially multidisciplinary literature, one of the most complex concepts to define is identity. Identity defined very differently also depending on which discipline you take, whether you are in psychology or in anthropology or in sociology or in philosophy for that matter, you may end up defining identity differently. So identity in essence is about who a person is, and that can be from a, let's say, social psychological perspective about how a person goes into different stages of life, or from a more connecting sociological concept of how a person socializes within social structures and how he became then shaped by those structures, but also how that individual shapes himself or plays through his own agency, plays a role in shaping those structures. There are many different ethno-cultural groups on planet Earth. I think during my indigenous studies, one of the quotes in some of the studies, they claim that there are something around 7,000 different ethno-cultural groupings on planet Earth. I think in Africa, it was, if you use, there have been many good updated studies on the ethnic landscape of Africa. Much of it we have inherited from the colonial order. In most of Africa, it was estimated that we have more than 2,000 plus ethnic identities, used to be called tribes, if you will. And so that is, and when you talk about this, sometimes it's not always the same, but you have to talking about also the linguistic diversity. So some share languages, the boundaries are not always clear, and sometimes they're very much artificial. But since especially if you look at the theory around identity as well, Benedict Anderson famously defines ethnicities as nations as imagined communities, and the same sometimes applies to ethnicities. So there are many different ethnicities on the African continent in the global order. They are not necessarily a source of conflict. In fact, in the majority of cases, they are not. But depending on the way politics play out in specific settings, in specific countries or societies, indeed, ethnic identities end up being a source of conflict. In fact, it's not really, strictly speaking, ethnic identities that are a source of conflict. It's the commodification by actors of ethnic identities that becomes a source of conflict. But the identities themselves are not a source of conflict, but rather they are made to be, let's say, an instrument in fueling intergroup conflicts, yes.
Oh, insightful. So, how hateful rhetoric, how hate speech ignites ethnic conflicts? I would love to hear this in concrete examples, Dr. Felix.
Oh, thank you very much. Last year, I published an article on social media, for example, in the landscape of the conflict probably that you have heard of, which is taking place in Eastern Congo with the ramification to neighboring countries. And I was looking at basically how hate speech on social media, YouTube, Twitter, WhatsApp, Facebook, is fueling and directly connecting to armed activities and armed violence in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And it was so this was an empirical study. I was looking at how specific claims on these social media instruments that we use all on a daily basis, how specific, insightful language used there translates on the ground, mobilizes community across continents for a shared purpose of, let's say, carrying certain given narratives directed at certain given communities. And that translates into violence against those communities. This is one specific example of, which is very modern one, of course, with the use of social media. But if you go back in history, Rwanda is a very good example of use of hateful rhetoric or violence. Many have studied the hate media in Rwanda. The word hate media was mostly used before the modern information technology to refer to radio and television, such as radio television of Milcolin in Rwanda in 1993-4, the heat of the genocide. And this media was specifically used to specifically target the Tutsi at the time. And in many cases, broadcasts would be made on radio about where to find people are hiding and so on, and direct people at where they should be going to go and find them and kill them. Those are some of the extreme cases, but we have many other less extreme, but equally, let's say, or at least in a good measure, but harmful, where you have everyday language of demonization of the other, of members of different ethnicities than yours, which translate either in increasing intergroup hostility or in even translating into acts of violence. So we have had many examples across the African continent where ethnic identities are used by some operatives as the differentiation element that should be antagonized in order to call for the hate of members of the different group. And this is most of the done by elites from certain given communities, not necessarily for the benefit of their own communities, but also for their own individual benefits.
Dr. Felix, hatred and hate speech is nothing new, but the scale of which is exponentially rising following the new digital technology, following the social media platform. How worrisome is that?
Very worrisome. It's interesting, just when Elon Musk was taking over Twitter from the former owners, I did an interview and a piece on a Nature scientific magazine, and we predicted precisely what is happening today, which was already visible, of course. I had just completed my study on the intensification of that. And what I want to come back to here is that in the past, I gave the example of the study I just completed last year, but also I gave the example of Rwanda a few years back. Rwanda used very old school, traditional radio, for example, was listened to by a lot of people, but not everyone owned the radio at the time. Not everyone listened to radio, and not even all places had reach of the radio. Even if, of course, that was a very centralized governance, which made it still effective that the killings took place nearly on all parts of the country, the intensity in which, or the scale to which people could so easily be reached at the time is not the same as today. Today, basically, a lot of people own mobile phones which use digital technologies. Messages of hate that you broadcast in Europe somewhere where I am reach Ethiopia in a second, and people can interact across the globe, across the globe on a common purpose, or can link up. So distance no longer matter. That's one. Second, social media, what makes it, besides breaking the distance, it's a very powerful tool of mobilization because people can hide behind anonymity in order to broadcast hate. So you no longer have to appear in order to be harmful. You can hide behind a fake name and still be very effective in inciting violence against a specific individual or group. So that fact of breaking barriers, but also anonymity and ubiquity, the fact that social media is everywhere, makes it a very powerful tool for the good generally. We use them to communicate in many ways, but also for even the spread of hate speech against specific individuals or specific communities. Yeah.
All right. Given the danger of hate speech, I think it's imperative to combat hate speech in any way we can. In connection with this, let me share the view of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Sorry. So Antonio Guterres once said, but we are far from powerless in the face of hate speech. We can and must raise awareness about its dangers and work to prevent and end it in all its forms. Surely there is something that we can do about it. So what's expected from different actors in combating hate speech? Like from media, from researchers like you and others?
It's quite indeed quite worrisome that countries across the globe, for that matter, and in different regions, haven't caught up at all with the development of digital technologies, for instance. Hate speech has always been a phenomenon for many years, so it does exist. But I believe probably in Ethiopia, as in many other countries, when there are laws in place, for example, for some kind of forms of incitement to violence, at least when I studied my undergrad years back, there were laws which were specific to when you incite a person to commit a crime or to commit violence against another person. There were very practical laws that could be applied in order to sanction you. So in many countries, the laws do exist against either hate speech, and for those countries where those laws do not exist, one of the strategies, of course, it would be to enact laws. And any lawyer, of course, knows that enacting laws is not enough until there is enforcement of those laws. So, and such laws should exist, whether you are talking about incitement in a general sense or incitement through social media. There should be regulations that regulate uses of social media. For example, I just highlighted 3 features of social media: the ubiquity, which breaks barriers, but also is everywhere. But also anonymity. For example, we can do away with anonymity. This thing of hiding behind aliases in order to be insightful can be easily regulated if countries want to regulate social media. And there should be, of course, in any country, but also at a global level, a concerted action to enforce such kind of regulations. Of course, I'm not naive. I don't see easily 190-something countries which compose the United Nations agreeing all together 100% to be very forceful in doing that. But some of the actions should always start at a state level. And the more there is practice from many countries, the more other countries are willing to join, and the more they are willing to come together for a concerted global, let's say, action. So there needs to be laws, there needs to be enforcement of those laws, and there needs to be quite strong regulations of tools that are used more to spread hate against the other, whatever the other is, individual or collective. ethnicity or otherwise.
So if ethnic conflicts occur and that turns to war, do you think those conflicting parties, do you think those ethnic groups who engaged in ethnic conflict can restore their peace and togetherness?
There are dynamics tracing this idea that there are actors, operators who trigger those kind of. Now, what do we do to address them through different processes and mechanisms? You mentioned the dialogue. It has always been in many African traditions. Many of the problems ended up being, or still end up being, solved through dialogue. Many African communities always went on a hill, under a caliver tree, whatever they practice in different parts of the continent, and they ironed out differences, and they had very many different processes. There have been studies which that in many African communities, traditional modes of justice are still more operational than the classical court system, for example, that we have inherited from the colonial order. Now, talking in an informal way, talking in formalized structures matters because through dialogue, you have space to iron out a difference. Second, formalized, of course, processes that can be taken at the community level, also at a national level, to institute proceedings where processes and programs of reconciliation can take place between groups, between individuals. Truth commissions and reconciliation commission, which may or may not include aspects of public forms of forgiveness, can be instituted. And depending on context, have been places where some forms of reparation, depending on what types of offenses have been committed, can be, say, requested. So all of these, depending on, again, context, depending on the specific dynamics of which conflicts you want to solve, can be mobilized to address or to tackle some of the conflicts that are happening between communities.
Let us talk about transitional justice. If we talk about conflict and war, there is no as such devastating conflict as Second World War. Even those conflicting parties, even those two blocs have been reconciled, and the victims of the war were healed and compensated through transitional justice. And ever since then, transitional justice has become a popular concept, isn't it? I know you have studied transitional justice a little bit far and wide. So what is transitional justice, and how the society can be reconciled through transitional justice, how it is practiced?
Transitional justice, of course, is also started with wide concept and complex concept. Transitional justice also is, I've indeed written extensively on this, it is a broad concept. There is a good definition that is widely used, which was proposed by the United Nations already from 2004. And I have seen a recent actualization of that. And I cannot quote it word for word, but at least it refers to a number of processes which come in different forms and shape, which are judicial or maybe not judicial, or quasi-judicial at least, which countries or societies use to come to terms with wrongdoings, violations, or violence committed in the past, as those societies try to move from that stage of violence towards more peace. And that definition always ends up giving some of the lists of such processes. And these sometimes include what we know, what many lawyers know, which may consist of prosecutions, but also they may consist of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, or investigative commissions. They have different names and they come in different shapes. They may include reparations programs, but also they may include may include institutional reforms programs, under the understanding that society structures of governance are part of the problem, and then things like vetting and resources and many are conducted to make sure that people who are involved in violence no longer hold where they can continue. Mm-hmm. And of course, they may also include things like forgiveness, as you say, but also things forms of programs or processes within the traditional justice mechanism. How are they decided? Many scholars of transitional justice will tell you there is no one formula for deciding which.
It depends on context.
Exactly, which mechanisms works or might work where is very much context specific. As I said already, explaining the definition, there have been, as I said already, explaining the definition, there have been, there are websites. If you look at, for example, International Center for Transitional Justice, they have lists of where they have such commission have existed. You read people like Priscilla Heiner, you will find updated lists, not updated, but at least long list and study in depth of the different processes. So different countries from the 1970s, especially in Latin America, but also in South African countries such as Uganda, did institute different processes to deal with the past, the violations of the past. Some were quite relatively successful, others were not, were actually sometimes even failures. And you use the word how to those processes heal the wounds of the victim. That's another term which I would qualify a little bit. Healing after some violations simply is not possible. So sometimes you have really violence, you have considered genocide, where someone loses the entire family and the sole survivor. Talking about healing this person would be too much, probably expecting or asking. But at least having a process which helps this kind of person to move forward and carry on with life, feeling as being in a space of relative peace, if you will, and able to cohabitate with other members of his or her society. That may be probably the minimum kind of target that you can have. So in some cases, indeed, you have some processes which may alleviate the pain of the victims. As you said, of course, I spent years in the field of victimology, and one of the things they tell you about victims as well is that there is not one format of victims. There is no one, victims are not a monolith, not one way that victims feel or react. There are many different victims who feel differently about exactly the same thing and who may react differently. So what these processes at least serve to do is to be importantly contextualized, be used in a given situation, and to be successful, they need exactly to listen to the needs or to be very attentive to the needs of the victims. And there are many different ways of identifying them. Of course, part of the many transitional justice mechanism, what they do is to do fact finding. Fact finding is a core element of that. And so one of your questions was, how do you identify who is the victim and how do you try to make sure that victim heals, the wounds heal? Part of the starting exercise, of course, to do fact finding, to know what happened, to whom, by whom was responsible. And through such processes, so for example, one of the most known on the continent process that was used in post-genocide Rwanda was the Gacaca. So the very first stage of the Gacaca process was precisely fact-finding. go on a hill where the crimes happened, ask the community what happened here, and people who, of course, were there, lived there, would try to tell what happened. Sometimes they will, most of the time they will know. Sometimes you might find that there was no one who was there at that time. So in some cases, then the truth will really never be known. But in quite a number of cases, you will find information. So fact-finding, in many cases, some form of investigation, formal or informal, at a hill or through kind of organized bodies, is the first step. Then the second, you have to choose to find out through fact-finding who were affected, who were involved, and then decide what to do, both with the victims and with the perpetrators. And what is important in intergroup conflicts, keeping all of the caveats that I used at the beginning, dynamics, it may not always be that you have victims here and perpetrators here. It's this time in some conflict, it's very complex. Victims one day may be perpetrators the other day, and a victim may as well be a perpetrator. So we have to also, when you navigate these processes, to understand the complexity and be ready to deal with the complexity of such situations. And through that, then you have also then to really be courageous enough and to be bold enough to know what to do then when you are dealing with such complexities. And it's for that reason sometimes one of the most tricky part of the engaging in transitional justice mechanism is to find what is the appropriate response. What is the appropriate mechanism to adopt? Are we going for prosecution? Are we just doing truth and reconciliation, forgiveness without prosecution? Are we doing reparations, forgiveness, and so on? Those will be context dependent, based also on some other calculus, such as the politics of the moment. What is likely to cause less pain to the victim or to the relative peace of the community you are trying to serve?
Identifying the victims and perpetrators of crime is not an easy task. In fact, it's a central and controversial part of the transitional justice process. And as an expert and researcher of victimology, you have explained it very well, and thank you very much. And then can you tell me the experience of different countries that realize peace and stability through transitional justice?
Post-conflict peace should never be simplified. It's something that most of the time, which is achieved through a coalescence of paths. So you should always be wary about the idea that this is what made society come to peace. This only. It's quite a lot of a set of different things. Politics after the conflict matter, justice after the conflict matter, and of course other social processes that are put in place matter into what governance you put in place, what mechanism, structures and processes, and what actors you involve, and so on. All of those matter. So you should look at what makes peace as something plural. With that in mind, we have had quite many countries which have experimented with transitional justice. As I said, there have been so many processes of transitional justice across the history of uses of that concept and mechanisms. In the 70s, much of transitional justice was concentrated in Latin America, countries like Chile, Argentina, among the first that experimented with transitional justice mechanisms to deal with crimes which were committed by military juntas, which were fashionable around that time in that part of the world, and which committed quite a lot of human rights violations. One of the most famous, of course, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, probably you have discussed with some of your other guests, is the South African one. So after Nelson Mandela was released, he went through a constitutional negotiation process in South Africa to put an end to the apartheid regime, white domination, going through towards a democratic South Africa. And there were many different political considerations that were taken in place not to go for trials, which would then destabilize probably relative peace, and probably to which the white minority would not have assented to. So they ended up instituting the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is one probably of the most famous one. And so the idea was to do precisely fact-finding, what happened in specific renowned incidents, who were the actors, and sometimes you had acts of forgiveness. We have many images of those times with sometimes listening to testimonies of victims with people like the late Bishop Tutu crying during some incidents. There are still some of them who are alive, and as Ethiopia thinks about that, some of the people like Pumla Gulobo, part of the process, would be very important people to talk to. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, post-genocide Rwanda experimented with a unique process, the Gacaca Code, which combined both the truth finding and the reconciliation aims of TRCs. Also had a strong punitive, but more or less diluted punitive dimension, where prison sentences were pronounced by the Gacaca courts at the Hill level. And of course, you have international prosecution. So you have had many countries also which have most of the clients of the International Criminal Court are from the African continent, and most of these cases deal with large-scale violations committed during some of the conflicts on the continent. So many countries have experimented with that. Those include also, the Democratic Republic of Congo. You have had Sierra Leone special court, and they have had in the conflict in Liberia processes there. Many have experimented with these mechanisms.
All right.
If you read a lot of scholarship, it will tell you that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa played a role in bringing relative peace to South Africa. If you read many people, they will tell you problems in South Africa have not ended. There are still some even racial issues, among many other social problems. So some will even tell you that things were just put under the carpet. But the fact of the matter is that many would predict that the worst would have happened if they didn't choose probably that path, given the power dynamics and the socio-political situation of the time. So South Africa is one good example. Rwanda used its own mechanisms. There are quite many different opinions on Gacaca, since it was very unique, but part of the traditional mechanism. But there are many others as well, besides Latin America. I mean, you have had many Truth and Reconciliation Commission also in countries which are not, strictly speaking, post-conflict countries. You have some in Canada, some states of the US, and some men, for example. In South Korea, many countries, in New Zealand, many countries trying to address specific violations have used these mechanisms, at least as a way of trying to atone to what happened in the past and try to give a sense of healing or moving on, at least, at very least.
All right. I tried to assess the process and the outcome of transitional justice in various parts of the world, like in Latin America, such as in Brazil and Colombia, and here in Africa, in countries like CAR, Central African Republic and South Sudan. I see transitional justice was not successful in these countries. So my question is, why sometimes transitional justice failed to achieve peace? Many of the countries that implemented transitional justice achieved peace, but very few countries, like those which I mentioned earlier, couldn't achieve peace through transitional justice. So the question is, why so?
A very good one. And it connects precisely to part of the answer I gave in just the previous question. I said that we should always analyze the success or failure of transitional justice mechanism against the background of other processes that are taken in that context to address, let's say, the country's problem. for any mechanism to be successful, or for any policy for that matter to be successful, it has to come at a good time, but also there has to be enough will. And most of the time, if you're looking at the politics, you talk about political will, so there has to be the right political will. But it goes beyond politics, at least political imperative, but also there has to be that thirst by the communities to engage in that process. So anything that comes as just imposed or ticking boxes, there seem to be rare chances of success. So after in the 90s, in many of conflicts of the 90s, and even some not so recent past, some kind of recent past, it was almost fashionable for any post-conflict country to follow some kind of prescriptions. We have just concluded a peace agreement, so this is the ticking box. These are the boxes we need to tick. We have to do a truth commission, and we will get donor funding from ABC and the European Union funding and so on, and then we will start and so on. That's really not the best way to go about the business. There has really to be an internally owned process where people want it, or at least the ruling political classes are willing to invest enough to really finding solutions through that, and to explaining to the people probably who don't understand yet why that is necessary, and have them buy into that. Only when there is such ownership would any of such process have any chance of achieving something, being relatively successful. Mm-hmm. So I know there have been some commissions really which intervened. For example, if you have a truth commission in the middle of a war, mm-hmm. which is still raging, now there have always been this debate whether these processes can contribute to putting an end to the conflict or not. The fact of the matter is that debate remains open, but many would argue that most of the processes took place when much of the conflict, at least, had ended. So when people are ready to engage in the issue.
All right. So I'm not saying. All right. Sorry for interruption, Dr. Felix. Sorry for interruption. We are on the verge of finalizing our interview, but one last question for you. Do you think the participation of third parties is important in the transitional justice process of a certain country? For example, what if United States or China or any other countries get involved in the upcoming transitional justice in Ethiopia? Or to put it in short, what are the pros and cons of involving, inviting third parties in the transitional justice process?
Thank you for the question. Mindful of the time. There's nothing wrong per se to have third party being involved in any aspect of the post-conflict settlement. And I chose here to speak broadly. So maybe peace process making, reconciliation making. And many of our countries, the developing countries, tend to need financing from external powers to supplement their own finances after conflict. So them intervening, funding some aspect of those, I see no problem. So my qualified answer would be, it depends on what kind of intervention. In any area, we know that if that kind of intervention is directive, it's problematic. We talk about sovereignty of countries, of peoples. So that should translate in them having the first say to determine what they want, where they want to go, and how they want to do that. And that should be left for Ethiopians, for sure. And for communities within Ethiopia, because I know Ethiopia is a very plural country, different sensibilities. And that's why also applying a template wouldn't work for Ethiopia. So Ethiopians have to find their own voice to negotiate the way they want to go about it, to address all issues from all different kind of sources of problems, let me put it in that polite way. And then any support that they can get would be meaningful if it comes only to complement and to support a process and a vision that the Ethiopians have shaped for themselves, drawing lessons from other contexts, absolutely. Everyone learns from others, but contextualizing that, deciding on their own where they want to go, and charting that road forward with others only in a support role.
All right. Dr. Felix Nahinda, researcher and consultant based in Netherlands, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for making time to conduct this interview in your busiest schedule. I really appreciate your collaboration. Have a successful time and take care, yeah?
Thank you very much. My pleasure to talk to you.
As Ethiopians are in the process of implementing transitional justice, we, Amhara Media Corporation, Amico, will continue to present you strong and diverse intellectual views regarding this super important agenda of Ethiopia, transitional justice. And I hope you enjoyed today's edition of the program. Have a good time with the rest of our programs. Bye for now.